From the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to Open Line. I'm Ben Hall. Good show tonight. We're diving into one of the most emotional and contentious issues that has come before the council this year. What should Nashville do about short-term rental properties like Airbnb? Some neighborhood groups want them heavily regulated, perhaps done away with altogether. Then you have some property rights groups who say that tramples on the rights of property owners and we shouldn't do anything differently than what is being done now. Council members are working on what to do. Is there some sort of happy medium? We are happy to have with us tonight two council members who are working on this. Metro Council Member at Large, Bob Mendez. Thank you, Councilman, for being here.
Thanks.
And Metro Council Member Berkeley Allen. Thank you very much for being here. All right. So there, I attempted to lay out the issues. You've been working on this a long time, Councilwoman. What got you to this?
So this started in 2012 when there were 200 of these, and the folks who were running the historic bed and breakfast, which had some very specific and pretty detailed requirements on how to operate a historic bed and breakfast in a neighborhood, and they had to put up the red and white signs and have a public hearing and get neighborhood buy-in, and they had to live there and have health inspections. And they said this new thing has come out of nowhere and there are no regulations. We need to level the playing field.
Right.
Either we don't have any rules or they need some rules, and clearly we need rules. So we spent probably a year looking at what other cities had done, trying to figure out what was going on in Nashville, drafting legislation, meeting with all the different departments, and then kind of came up with our first run at this, which is now drastically different from where we are now, and even took it to neighborhood groups. And interestingly, at that point, this is back in 2012 when there were only 200 of them, the questions that I kept hearing more than anything were, why do we need rules? This is no big deal. I should be able to do what I want to with my property. So we continue to say this could be good for Nashville. It has been an interesting part of the sharing economy. It gets people in our neighborhoods, but we've got to protect the character of the neighborhoods.
Right.
We need rules.
Right.
So that version got amended several times, but was ultimately passed after a fairly long public hearing that many people have forgotten about by now, different council at that time. And at that point, there were people who showed up who didn't like it because it had rules, and another group of people who showed up who didn't like it because they felt restricted their property rights. But nonetheless, it at least gave us a framework to work with.
Right.
It had a long rollout time, and we sort of gave people 6 months to go through the registration process before we even started enforcing anything.
So they had to register. Okay, so that was the first thing. So at first there was nothing. Airbnb, I mean, you could go on and put your house up for rent just for overnight. It's kind of like a hotel. I mean, what I've heard is some hotels are quite concerned about this. You mentioned bed and breakfast. Hotels are concerned about it. There was a 2-hour, and I'll jump ahead a little bit. There was the 2-hour public hearing at the last council meeting.
Correct.
And the nightmare scenario is that you're having these bachelorette parties coming to neighborhoods, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on. I mean, is that what you were hearing?
Yeah. So fast forward, now there's the best guess is somewhere around 4,500 instead of a couple hundred. About 2,500 have permits, and about 2,000 best guess don't have permits.
Okay.
And and there's some bad actors. There's some places that are loud and not considerate of neighbors, and really truly conducting hotel-like activities in neighborhoods. Some are permitted ones, a lot are unpermitted ones, and wrestling with how to deal with this blowing up by 20 times in just a couple of years, and balancing property rights and neighborhood rights is that's what's drawn my attention to it.
And so a thought might be a moratorium meaning a short-term sort of ban while we kind of look through the issues here.
Correct. What has been proposed would be a moratorium only on new permits for the non-owner occupied type, the type where the person never lives in the house. They own it. they may show up to let the new guest in, or there may be a management company that does that. That's as opposed to the type where I live in my house and I'm opening up a room for someone to rent, where I'm actually on the premises and I will know if there's an issue with loudness or whatever. Those we have had very, very, very few problems with those types. And during the long public hearing last week, there weren't complaints about the types where the owners live. Most of the complaints were about the ones that we call non-owner occupied, or type 2 is another terminology.
So it's those rental property ones.
So it's they're all rental.
Right, they're short-term
right.
rental, but if they never live there.
They never live there, exactly right.
People may have a duplex and
Investor-owned,
they
you could
turn
call
it into one of these Airbnbs. I mean, it used to be you could rent something out, and get a monthly thing. Now you could rent it out every weekend and make even more money.
That's correct.
And so we're seeing that. And so there's some neighborhood groups that say a moratorium is not enough. They want a ban
Correct.
on these rental property or the non-owner occupied
Right.
ones.
Investor owned.
Investor
That's
owned.
probably an easier way to
Yeah,
say
the
it.
investor owned. Then there are property rights groups that say that's inappropriate. The Beacon Center has said, if you do that, we're going to ask the legislature to step in and say Metro Council's overstepping their bounds.
Yeah,
What about
so
that?
There's several things there. As far as the far, I'll call libertarian position of you're trampling property rights, you can't have regulations like this. The Beacon Center brought a lawsuit, lost that argument in our courts here in Davidson County. So I take them seriously at their threat to go to the state, but clearly a city is allowed to regulate this sort of thing as long as the regulations are reasonable. The state has the power to take that away from us. I hope they don't do that. Chattanooga has outlawed investor-owned short-term rentals. Hendersonville has. My hope is that, given the fact that there's multiple cities across the state, some that tend to lean a little more right, some that tend to lean a little more left, that the state legislature leaves this to be the local issue that it should be.
And so this issue of a moratorium, when might we know? Is this going to come up in February? Is that right?
That's when it will be back
this?
before the council. The council has agreed to hold a special meeting, an open meeting, so that we can kind of think our way through how best to do that, if that is the most appropriate thing. I think we'll have some dissenting opinions on that to decide if that makes sense. Our hope is simply that when we have our meeting in February, that we don't have 10 different people that had great ideas that all overlap and conflict with each other. So,
And a moratorium is an indication at this point you're not sure what to do.
we just feel like we need to pause things. I mean, there was clear evidence that enforcement is a problem. There are a number of properties that have not been dealt with in a prompt manner. We don't need to continue to add to that until we are able to deal with that problem. I feel like we have some new tools to work with. A number of council members sent the mayor a letter and asked for help, and she responded by hiring an outside consultant who came in and talked to all the stakeholders and has given us some specific recommendations that I'd like to see put in place in this pause that we've created to see if that makes a difference.
Well, and Berkeley is, when she uses we, it's her and another council person that are talking about a moratorium. I don't think a moratorium makes sense at this time. It's a complicated posture. There is a lawsuit pending. There was a court order in November, and the current bill that's pending is designed to narrowly fix the problem raised in the lawsuit, which is just about some definitions. And my perspective is that we should fix the definition problem that got raised in the lawsuit and not have a moratorium. I think we've got the same end goals, but I don't think that a moratorium at this time is the right answer. And if we have a moratorium, I think there's some devil in the details that could slow us down, as whether it's a total moratorium or a moratorium only outside of downtown, or exactly how that would work.
Right.
So you think a moratorium is a good idea. What do you think we should do at this moment then?
I think the pending bill fixes a very narrow problem raised in the lawsuit and I think we should pass it to fix the problem, and we can carry on with this conversation about what the long-term solution is. As Council Lady Allen mentioned, the city needs to get better at enforcing existing rules, both short-term rental rules and noise and garbage and public decency, public drunkenness rules. And if we got better at doing that, it would go a long way to solve the problems that our neighborhoods are facing. So I think we should pass the law that's on the table to fix a narrow problem and then continue this conversation.
All right, let's. We have a few calls. Let's take a call here. Let's go to Laura. Hello, Laura.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
I have a question about the ordinance that is currently under consideration that I guess is pretty much the same as it was last fall. I'm curious as to how the rationale is that there is, turn that down, that there is a primary use when all we really have is that these STRPs are secondary or accessory uses, and yet there is no underlying primary use if the building is used only as a short-term rental. So how do they justify this carefully crafted ordinance if the language itself is misleading? Thank you.
And
STRP meaning short-term rental property.
Short-term rental, right? We can both work. I'll let the lawyer clean up the things that I don't say right. But when we first wrote this ordinance back in 2012, we talked about different ways to classify this or to allow it, and there are these different types of things. You can permit it, you can permit it with conditions, you can use it as a conditional use, or you can do an accessory use. That's the language to which this phone call is referring. And back then, after much discussion with department heads and legal folks, we decided accessory use, which means it is an additional use on top of what the property is mainly meant to be used for, which is a home. Mm-hmm. And so what we've said is this structure, its primary use is to be a home, but we will allow an accessory use, which is a home for a short time, as something that can be done if the permit is applied for and all these conditions are met. So that's nothing new in this pending ordinance. We've simply carried that language along for 3 years now. It's not anything new. It's just something that's gotten attention now that people are talking about it.
And I would add, that question goes to the core of the most contentious comments from both ends of the spectrum. Let's set aside short-term rentals for a second and talk about long-term rentals. There is an inherent friction between, on the one hand, renting out a property for the long term is a business activity. People do it to make money. That means a long-term rental in a neighborhood could be called a commercial use in a neighborhood. And that's been going on forever, and clearly that sort of business use is okay in a residential neighborhood. As we move from long-term rental to short-term rentals where it's strangers next door turning over every single weekend that you don't know who they are, you don't know if you can trust them, that same concept of a business in a neighborhood, once it becomes a short-term rental, is much more inflammatory. And that goes to neighbors, and I think rightfully so. And that goes to the core of the question of, is this a business activity or is this a use of a home?
It's a fascinating question, and you're allowed to put zoning restrictions on, and is this just some extension of that? I mean, there's so many things we can talk. All right, we have to take a break. All right, if you're on the line, hold on. If you want to call in, a few lines are open. 615-737 plus 615-737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.